Well, first of all, thanks a lot for this introduction and for giving me the opportunity to speak to such an audience and to be part of this nice network. So it seems a very nice initiative, and I thought it was a good idea to share a bit what we are doing to increase the opportunity to interact. So let me try to share the presentation.
Thank you.
Yes, you see it correctly, I guess. Yeah, basically, I will try to talk a bit about paper that we published in 2021 and the following studies, like testing the theoretical framework that we propose there. And basically what we are trying to do is, as many ecologists, we try to answer the general question of what caused the stability of ecosystem, and particularly in response to global change drivers. So this is a rather clear and common goal, I guess, for many of us. And specifically in this talk, I will try to connect a bit to field of research, the field of ecological stability with the field of functional traits. There has been several attempts to connect these fields, which we realized in a way that they had been a bit disconnected over the years. So we try to make a review of the connection of the fields, which we published like in 2021. And so in this talk, first I will talk about stability. Maybe it will be a bit sort of basic for many of you, but I thought that it is important to clarify the terminology and the idea before trying to connect the things with traits also, because we know that people talk about Babylonian confusion when we talk about how ecologists face stability. And we know that there are many definitions of stability. Grimm and Wissel found almost 170 definitions of stability. So I will generally use a very pragmatical way to focus on this and ecological functions that we are interested in and the variation over time. This usually is, we know all of us, it is usually productivity or biomass in plants. And usually we can measure several things. One simple is the coefficient of variation, and it is called constancy or internal variability. And then as I will talk during this session, generally, I think researchers are also interested in another component, which is resistance and recovery after a particularly extreme or particularly marked disturbance or stress event. So generally the deviation from the normal trend is called resistance, and recovery or resilience is the time to recover. And sometimes researchers call all of this, you see my cursors I guess they call it altogether resilience. We know that there has been a lot of discussion in ecology of the role of biodiversity or biological communities to maintain their stability. And McCann proposed several mechanisms. We'll go through them, hopefully not too slowly, to explain how and why we can connect them to traits. McCann mentioned three of them. There is a fourth one, which I will describe later on. But generally, the first one is the so-called averaging effect or portfolio effect, which is simply the relationship between the number of species and usually the coefficient of variation in biomass, so productivity. There is a mathematical relationship between the two, particularly if we have an equal amount of biomass of the different species. So when we have evenness, we have a more marked relationship. This relationship, however, is not just purely mathematical. Has been created some debate on whether it's just mathematical or not. This author, Doc, calls about statistical inevitability, but it requires several conditions. And one of these conditions is that the species don't fluctuate in a synchronical way between them. What does it mean? If we have two species and they fluctuate exactly in the same way a long time, their sum, so the community total biomass, will fluctuate more than the single species. So the synchrony of the species will create instability because it creates bigger variability of the sum of the two. this is the positive correlation or covariation between species. The opposite is true as well. When you have a perfect negative correlation or negative covariation between species, then generally we obtain a stabilization. And this is called generally compensatory dynamics. Everything in the middle is stabilizing community. So from synchrony to anti-synchrony, any deviation from synchrony, which is sometimes called asynchrony, is stabilizing communities. Here, I would like to make a rather silly and stupid example to explain why this is actually not possible when we have many species. So here we have an example of my former research team in Czech Republic when I was living there. And you see here that you can have perfect synchrony, but you cannot have perfect anti-synchrony because there are a limited amount of states in which you can be. So you cannot have perfect negative correlation between all species in the community. So synchrony cannot decrease indefinitely when increase the number of species. And this will information will come useful later on. So we try to basically assess this idea by McCain, in which we say, okay, so synchrony should decrease stability, richness because of the averaging effect should increase stability. And according to McCain, richness should decrease synchrony by increasing the chances that there are species with different response to the environment. So I'm slowly going into the direction of response diversity. We tested this using a database of around 90 data sets around the world with some now 11,000 plots, which is called long-term vegetation sampling, or we call it LOTUS, which we assembled together with my postdoc, Rica Valencia. And this is the first paper we published. There were no traits, but basically we show, yes, each line here is a data set. The data sets are spread, of course, in richer countries. So each line is one data set of points within a given location. And we see that the amount of data sets that are significant with the color. So we see that in many data sets, of course, any decrease of synchrony stabilizes the community. This is clear. So then we also see that richness or any measurement of species diversity didn't increase so much stability. We see that is 25% of the cases, significant. So yes, synchrony matters more than richness. This is generally what we know. But also what was interesting is that the relationship between expected relationship between richness and synchrony is not occurring exactly because of this. Because you can increase the species at some moment, actually, you increase the synchrony between them, what we think. There is for those expert in this field, there is a trick for some people use given indices like phi by Loro and colleagues, which is mathematically related to the number of species. And we think that these need to be, like say, this relationship need to be accounted when testing this effect by using null models or whatever, and then this relationship disappear. We can discuss more about it, but because it's about traits, I will not spend too much time on it. And then the last mechanism by which biodiversity should stabilize community is the so-called insurance effect. And then there where really we can speak about response diversity. This is clear parallelism with investment in stock exchange. And the idea is that if there is a market crisis, the one that has more different products will probably resist better the shock of the economical crisis. So similar in the community, if you have a community with different species with different environmental preferences, which we can call response diversity, the community should respond better because there will be some species that will withstand the crisis, let's say. Increasing number of species in the community increases the chance that there is a higher response diversity. And I will try to explain in the next slides also, response diversity itself is not enough for maintaining stability. We also need that the species with different response have also similar effect on the ecosystem. And I will speak about this in a second. And I also want to clarify a slight, but important for me at least, distinction between insurance and compensatory dynamics, which often people treat as equal. For me, compensatory dynamics is a long-term replacement of species, and insurance is a one-time replacement of species. It is, from the point of view of response diversity, doesn't change so much the idea, but from the way that we tested it is usually different. When we focus on competitor dynamics, we usually use coefficient of variation. Years without bigger extreme events, we focus on synchrony, evenness, and when we focus on resistance and recovery, usually we use other indices like ratios of biomass before and after the stress, dominance change, change in species composition, etc. So I think it's both are based on response diversity, but they act in a way that is slightly different to me. And then the final mechanism by which we need to consider is that maybe not so much the number of species that cause stability, but the type of species that we have. If the species itself are stable, the community will be stable. If the species don't change too much over time, we cannot explain. If the dominant species don't change very much over time, we cannot expect a big change in ecosystem function. And this is sometimes has been estimated by the mean population growth, mean population coefficient of variation, and things like that. And then we will see how to approach this with traits. Last slide, before we talk about traits, we can even try to decompose these mechanisms. Here, when we focus on coefficient of variation, we can try to decompose the effect of dominance, averaging, and synchrony with real data. And we can just partition of different measurement of CV that has been proposed by Jules, Segrestan, and of course myself. I do think that this framework is very useful. We had a lot of discussion with Jules. I think that dominance effects are underestimated by this framework. But anyway, it's a useful tool, I think. So yes, now we can talk about traits. We all know that traits has been becoming a bit fashionable, maybe even too much. Like even people talk about revolution in biodiversity studies, which of course we know that it's a bit an overstatement. But it's clear that ecologists are looking more and more at traits rather than just the species identity or species number. This is clear. This usually means, well, first, some advertisement. We have a book on, particularly, we think it's useful for students, as Sam was mentioning that in early phases of his career, he was looking at some of our papers, and particularly from the methodological analysis, data analysis point of view, this can be useful. And we have the book is not for free, but we have the whole our material is for free if you just Google it, basically. And we also organize some courses for students, PhD, usually, and master students. But yes, usually the field of traits can be summarized like this. We have a performance of the organisms, something that is difficult to measure on many species, and then we try to find some proxies, seed mass, vegetation height, leaf specific area, and so on. So simple things that can be measured on a lot of species that are less strongly related to performance, but we can use it to infer the performance. We know that this has several limitations. We tried to summarize the limitation of this field recently, but this is basically what people are doing, and it's still, I think, useful, although there are some limitations. The classic paper by Sandra Lavorel and Henri Garnier in 2002 introduced the idea that by knowing how the species respond to the environment, so the traits that make the species respond to the environment, and by knowing the effect of the species to the environment, we can predict the consequences of any change of the environment to the ecosystem function. This has a basic idea that has to be, I need to speak about it, although you probably know about it very well already, and is the distinction between response and effect traits, which is a mostly theoretical distinction. Very often it's difficult to distinguish them, but in some context we can talk about response to drought. So we look for the adaptation to drought, which you see here, some adaptations to drought, but very often, not very often, sometimes the adaptations to the environment are not the same that cause an effect of a given ecosystem of a function of interest. If I'm interested in pollination, these traits related to drought are not the same. If I look to a nitrogen fixing or abilities, these are not the same. So effect traits might be different from response trait. And that is the question that I want to also to address during this talk. When we know which traits to measure, which can be already tricky, but what we should estimate, instead of measuring the number of species in a community, to estimate how ecosystem function work. In this paper, we basically suggest two indices, which you are probably all familiar about: community weighted mean, so the traits of the dominant species, and functional diversity, so the variance of traits in a community. Why we focus on them? If we take any community or group of individuals, if we measure height for students, we can have a distribution like this. We can call this, like for students' height, we can call it trait density distribution, and we can characterize it by different measurements. In mathematical terms, usually this is the first moment of a distribution, this is the second variance. So we usually focus on the mean and the variance. And the mean usually reflect the traits of dominant species. So Grime was speaking about the mass ratio hypothesis, actually on a concept from Houston. But anyway, he said that the traits of dominant species exert at a given point of time. He was not speaking about temporal series. In a given point of time, the traits of dominant species exert the biggest effect on ecosystem functions. And the alternative theory is the one from Tillman and so on, that say that if you have a very diverse community with response diversity, you will this different species will use different resources, and there will be a more complete use of resources. So we have non-additive effect, complementarity, and such type of mechanisms. We have some sort of expanded this framework to different scales. You can apply it within individual, within species, communities, regions, universe, planets, whatever. But this is the idea. You can describe the trait distribution with different descriptors, and you can actually apply the same concept at different scales. And the last concept, before showing some examples how to connect trait to stability, that I need to introduce is the concept of trade-offs, which we all know from McCarthy and Wilson. We know that species cannot be good at everything. Even in humans, we know that we can run fast, but not for long, and vice versa, long, but not very fast. And this is actually, there is a trade-off in type of muscles. There is also doping, or no, we know, but generally it's a different type of body types. We know that in plants it works like number of seeds and weight of seeds and so on. So we all know this, and we all know that generally this has been translated in trade-offs like R-K strategy. And there is where we can talk about stability, because R and K strategies, sometimes called acquisitive and conservative species or whatever, have different temporal strategies. The R strategies are the one that recover faster after disturbance, but also they fluctuate more. They are more opportunistic. They don't have a conservation of resources. So when the year is good, they grow very much. When the year is bad, they don't grow very much. On the contrary, the K strategies or conservative species, they store resources. And when the year is good, they store the resources. And when the year is bad, they use their stored resources, or what Chesson called the buffer population growth. So this trade-off has also implication on the stability. Our species should be more unstable, and K species should be more stable. This has been translated to different things like CSR scheme by Grime or LHS scheme by Westoby. These, of course, apply only to plants. This should apply also to different type of organisms. But the idea is basically that we can try to find traits that describe such trade-offs. So let's now see how we can connect traits to different mechanisms. We cannot connect traits to the average effect because it's purely or greatly an effect of the number of species. So I will not talk about it, but let's focus now on compensatory mechanisms, so the asynchrony. What drives synchrony? Well, there is this paper by Adler, and generally the idea is that the more similar the species, the more they should have similar adaptation to the environment, and so they should fluctuate together. So similar species should fluctuate together, and dissimilar species should fluctuate differently. So the temporal correlation between species should decrease. There are not many studies. So this is actually the first connection really to response diversity. So the fact that the species have different traits should mean that they have different adaptation to the environment. So a community with different traits should have also different response diversity, right? So this is the first connection to response diversity and to the traits and stability. We have actually tested this with data from Jan Lepsch. Jan Lepsch is this guy here, sampling vegetation, and you see his sample site, study site. He sampled it for 20 years or something. Yeah, we tried this. We measure species functional dissimilarity and the temporal correlation between pairs of species. We plotted here this line. Relationship is not so strong. It's actually R square is around 10, 0, 10. The environment in which he has different treatments, fertilized without competitive species and so on, removal of the competitive species. There is not much an effect. So, but generally the idea is that when species are more different, they fluctuate less together. Actually, notice that this line doesn't go too low. So it means that generally the species are synchronous between them. There is a positive synchrony, and there is a decrease of synchrony by species that have different traits. So we can generally conclude that the common response to the environmental fluctuation make the species fluctuate together. We have observed this with ground beetles. And here, actually, we also moved to a greater scale, because we say that, okay, when you have in a community bigger diversity of traits, the community itself is less synchronous, and then there is more stable. You see it here, functional diversity and decrease of synchrony. Again, you see that there is never negative synchrony, but there is always decrease of synchrony. And so on. So functional diversity also increases a bit with number of species, but not crazily in this study. We have tried this also with our Lotus database, and here you see the percentage of data sets in which there was this relationship. This paper is not yet published, so it's ongoing. You see that generally this prevails. Well, this is the number of percentage of relationship, which the relationship was like this, negative. So you see it's prevailing, but significant is only around one third, depending on the traits. This is phylogeny, all traits together, leaf traits, height, seed mass, roots, or any traits. A bit of fishing expedition, but anyway, what I wanted to stress here is that people usually measure synchrony between pair of species as temporal correlation. This has a small risk when we do this, and it is in the context of global change, in which getting warmer or nitrogen deposition, we might have that long-term species trends. It means that some species slightly increase over time and some species decreases over time. And this, if we look at correlation, it inflates the correlation, showing some negative correlation between species, although year to year maybe they don't fluctuate negatively together. So we have tried to correct this in several ways. We have some papers to explain how to detrend these effects. And actually, when we do this, these effects get smaller. It means that part of this relationship is because some species are increasing over time, some species decrease over time, and they have different traits. And so it's getting more fertilized, so the species with the taller species, they increase. And so this negative correlation because of different traits is actually partially because of the trends, which we need to take into account when assessing this relationship. So I will skip for a second the insurance mechanism, focus on stability of dominance, and see how we can connect it to the traits. This is actually another one of the studies from Jan Lepsch, his first paper in 1982. He was doing a master, and he was sampling vegetation for several years, and 1 year was very dry. And he was like, no, my master thesis is destroyed, I cannot do anything. But his supervisor, Marcel Reimanek, very good ecologist, he said, wait, we can use this data because it's a special year to focus on resistance and resilience. So we had two fields, a 7-year-old abandoned field, so dominated by more ruderal, more acquisitive species, and old 50 years old field, still grassland, but old field, abandoned, and it was more dominated by conservative K-dominated species. And you see here that the R-dominated species, they are not very resistant. The biomass goes down very much in the drought year, but then they recover faster, okay? On the contrary, the dominated species, they resist a bit more. The rate of change is lower, but then it maintains, it takes longer to recover, okay? So this trade-off that I already mentioned about is telling us about the stability of species and their potential for resistance and resilience. So the first thing we did is to take his site, and we measure for each species, we measure the traits on site. So the leaf matter content, which again is sort of suggesting this trade-off between a more conservative, slow-growing species and fast acquisitive species, but without storage of resources. And we see some relationship, not fantastic, but still significant, in which we see basically the idea of succession, that the species with a lower capacity of buffer resource storage, they have lower stability. So this one, sorry, they have lower stability and they fluctuate more, they're more opportunistic, and the other ones, they are more stable over time. And the funny thing that I would like to stress here in this figure is that this range of leaf dry matter content, which is in one plot, 50 by 50 centimeters, or in the whole field side, which is, I don't know, half an hectare. This range is the almost say 70 or 80% of the range of the whole world. So it means that within a site, we have a lot of functional diversity. And this is something that it's interesting. We know, biologists, that species that coexist are different between them, and this is a clear evidence that it is the case. We tested this again with the Lotus data set. This figure is not fantastic, but the relationship is significant, even with a mixed model and even within different sites. So we tested it. And yeah, we use 11,000 permanent plots, and we basically find the idea that those species with the more conservative strategies, they are more stable. Something else that we find in this paper is that the species with higher leaf matter content are not only the more stable, but they're also the more dominant. Okay, we can speak about the Taylor power law and the slope of this Taylor power law and so on. If you're interested, we can discuss about it. But generally, the same trait, the species that are dominant tend also to be the ones that are more stable. So what we can do is actually measure the traits of the dominant species and try to assess these via different indices to assess how we can measure the stability. And this is what people like, well, Peter is included in this paper. And it is a very nice study, actually. The first one that clearly connects the puzzle pieces, in which we have here species richness affecting some measurement of response diversity. So we have functional diversity or phylogenetic diversity affecting synchrony. So this is the path that connects to these compensatory mechanisms. And then we have community-weighted mean, so the traits of the dominant species that connects to this dominant species effect. We see here that we have to make two effects of species diversity and functional diversity on asynchrony, not so much of the traits, I suppose, because functional diversity takes into account more multidimensional trait diversity, which is something that we also have. Often we don't have it only for single traits, but we have for multiple traits. Anyway, and then community-weighted mean affecting stability. So this is actually what we are suggesting, basically, or what they have been doing, to connect different measurement, take into account the traits of the community, either by functional diversity or community-weighted mean, to assess directly synchrony and directly community the coefficient of variation of the communities. We have tried this with German biodiversity exploratories. We have different sites, grasslands and forests across gradient conditions and land use in Germany. There has been already some paper from the group in which they connected this like synchrony and species richness to stability. And we actually introduced functional diversity and cumulative means, which are this. We don't see big effects of traits on stability, but we have an effect on the classic measurements of that we need to take into account to assess stability. So we talk about a mediating effect of traits on the components that regulate stability. It's not shown here, but we also see that the traits of plants influence the stability of arthropods, so that there is also a trophic cascade effect, how the traits of one trophic level affect the stability of other trophic levels. And then we can speak now a bit about the insurance mechanism, again with the German exploratories, and again assessing community-weighted mean, here with like slow, fast continuum, slow, fast, and the functional diversity. And we have different years, and Manuele Bazzichetto focused using indices of drought on particularly dry years. And what he sees basically is that when the year is very dry, which is the extremely dry, this yellow thing, community-weighted mean, no, sorry, when the very dry is the red one, sorry. When the year is very dry, community-weighted mean is not so important anymore, but it becomes, functional diversity becomes important. What does it mean? That what we summarize it is that when the things get worse, functional diversity kicks in. It's the idea again of response diversity, that in a good year, let's say normal year, the traits of the dominant make the work of the stability, but in the bad year, it's good to have some response diversity to, let's say, resist or to these extreme events. When we talk about resistance, and when we talk about mechanism of insurance, sometimes we focus only on the observed diversity, but we know that in a given community, observed diversity is only a portion of the species that could coexist in a given site, which is sometimes called dark diversity. Some people don't like this terminology, but it was created by Melis Partel. And so we try to expand this from the trait point of view. We have the observed diversity, the dark diversity, and their overlap is how much traits overlap between the species that are present and those that are potential. And we suggest that this overlap, the overlapping trait space between species present and potential one, could be a measure of redundancy in a community and how the community can withstand stress. So we tried this, and we see that this redundancy increase stability, and particularly more for those poorer sites. So we have this another published studies which we are working on, but the idea is that some species from the species pool can compensate the community, but if they have the similar traits, to replace those that are maybe lost from the observed diversity, and even more so when you have few species in your communities. There's been all the discussion about whether and how to measure functional redundancy, up to the point that some colleagues, good colleagues of course, they have suggested we should not talk about redundancy, but the mechanism of insurance often has been referred to redundancy. Some people don't agree. We have tried to explain our point of view in this forum, let's say. But the idea of Nico Eisenhower and colleagues is that we should only talk about, let's say, response diversity or dissimilarity in traits, but we think is not enough. And here we see a case in which we have a grass and nitrogen fixer, and it gets in drier, so we lose the nitrogen fixer. And of course, in this case, there is a little response diversity, so we lose the function. But here we have the same amount of species and generally the same amount of response diversity, just distributed in different ways. So if all the the species that like drought are nitrogen fixers. So if the response rate and the effect rates are correlated, when we lose this species because it gets in drier, then we lose the function. On the other hand, if I have the same response diversity but is distributed along different effect groups, then I have higher chances for stabilization, and so this is higher chances for insurance mechanisms. So redundancy is not just the amount of response diversity, but we also need that this response diversity is having a replacement of species, so different response traits, but they also have the same effect traits. So here, I lose those that are drought intolerant, but some species within this group is drought tolerant. So we need response diversity within a given effect group. I will skip this because it's getting a bit late, but this has been proposed in a way by the original definition of redundancy, but there are actually not many attempts to estimate this. This is one paper from La Liberté, which has some limitations, but it's a nice idea in which they try to define effect groups and then to say how many species or how much response diversity I have within this group that can actually cause redundancy and stability. And they not much used because there are some limitations to the approach, but yeah, it's interesting. Again, there is no time to discuss about this in detail, but we have tried different indices of redundancy with simulations, and they generally don't bring much more information with respect classical indices of species diversity and functional diversity. So in a way, I'm saying that Nico Eisenhower is right in a way, but still, I think that conceptually we are far from developing a good, conceptually mathematically, developing a good index of redundancy that reflects the insurance mechanism. I want to conclude with this slide saying that all these mechanisms I'm talking about, like that dominance, insurance, and complementarity, and the use of mean and variance approach can be applied at different scales within individuals, within the population, species pairs, multiple species, community, and so on. So this is what we explain in the paper. This is actually, most studies are the community level with community-weighted mean and functional diversity, but we are actually also working at the level of populations, even genotypes. It's another talk that I have ready that today I cannot have no time to talk about it, but there is a potential also to talk about this kind of things. So yes, stability has multiple drivers. It's important to disentangle them. Averaging effect and compensatory dynamics are related to species synchrony. So functional diversity, functional dissimilarity. Dominant species effect depend on the fast-low rate spectrum, so the dominance and community-weighted mean. Redundancy should be linked to the insurance hypothesis, but it still remains unclear how to test these things. And there is also potential for studies within populations, like populations that are more or less stable, genotypes that are more or less stable, and so on, but not much studies so far. So I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to give this talk, and I'm really looking forward to discuss a bit these results during today or in other context. Not sure if I should leave the presentation on because maybe we need to go back and forward, but or I can stop sharing. I will leave it on and then we can maybe.
That sounds great, Francesco. Thank you so much. That was a really fantastic talk. A real history lesson of a lot of these concepts as well. Really, really interesting. Thank you. Questions from the Zoom audience. Feel free to write any questions in the chat and I can read them to Francesco if you don't want to appear on the recording, or you can raise your hand like Pete is doing. Pete, please go ahead.
Hi, Francesco. Nice to see you again. I think it's 10 years since we met or over that, so a long time, but I've been following your work and It was great to see it
Same
presented. So,
here.
very nice to see it all. I had a question, a broad question, and that was that how much do you think, there's variation in studies like the one that you presented of ours that Dylan Craven led and yours? There's variation in how important each of these different drivers or components is. And I want, how much is this down to there's methodological choices, obviously, how you set the model up and so on. But there's also, differences in the amount of variation in each of these factors within these studies as well. So, within a biodiversity experiment, species richness is varying a lot over, at the low end of the gradient. Community weighted means it may be varying less so in comparison to, say, field conditions. And how much are the differences driven by this variation in how much variation there is in each of these facets within the data set that it was drawn from.
Hi. Anyway, yes, probably it's more than 10 years, but yeah,
Yeah.
yes. Thanks for the question. I'm not sure how to answer this question. But there is another component which is sometimes forgotten, is that these components are not independent neither. So functional diversity is not independent of community mean. There is a unimodal relationship, like in the experiment that you have, or that was designed in Bern, I think. It was designed, I think, or even in the Yen experiment, I think the idea is that you create a gradient in fast slow, right? And then basically, if you have fast and you have slow communities, you don't have functional diversity or very little, because you have all the fast grower and the slow grower. And where do you have functional diversity? In the middle. So the two things are not completely independent. So this is definitely, as you say, the range of these values affect clearly the relative effect, the range, and yeah. So I'm not sure if there is any way to disentangle this, except that doing some experiments. And if you do experiment again, you are falling in the same trap in a way. So yeah.
Yeah, no,
There is
I agree, because
many
there's
different.
some elements that you just cannot separate. They're just too biologically entangled to
Yeah.
completely separate them. Yeah.
So, for example, what we suggest when we do experiments trying to disentangle the role of functional diversity and community mean, we actually suggest to make shorter gradients to avoid the extremes, okay? So to have some sort of orthogonal combination of values. But then, again, you are then restricted the range. So it's like the how to say, Italy, we say that life is a short blanket. You cannot be completely covered. If your feet are cold and you put the blanket on your feet, then you feel cold here. So I'm not sure there is any way around, except that trying several studies and see what are the common patterns and what is the range of variation. But yeah.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I mean that was actually my follow-on question, was about the covariation, which is also just impossible to get rid of. I know in the exploratories, for example, the species richness and the fast slow gradient, in some exploratories the correlation is like 0.9. So this is to the point where you can't actually statistically disentangle it very easily. Even with structural equation models or whatever other methods you can use to try and pull it apart, it just you can't do it when the correlation's that strong. But yeah, like you
Yeah,
say, we can.
in this case, in this paper was exactly the case, because here, if you replace functional diversity with species diversity, you get exactly the same model. Okay, so
Yeah.
it's true that it was not related, not exactly the same model. Actually, both were maintaining the model, but yes, we have really to be careful all the time. I mean, in ecology with empirical data about these covariations, because they are fun part to deal with in nature, but they're also not very fun statistically. So I'm not sure that there is any solution, as there was never solution actually when studying biodiversity effect on ecosystem functions. Yeah. If you go to any biodiversity experiment, then you are sort of fixing a species pool, right? You are selecting a species pool, while in natural ecosystem you have and you're excluding actually by weeding very often. I know that in Bern there is a weeded and non-weeded part, if I remember well. But yeah, so it's a tricky thing, because the species pool also has the potential to compensate or to replace species that are lost, and this is often in the temporal sense and being often not taken into account.
Yeah, I think the biodiversity experiments, I don't know if you know a paper we did, Malte Jochum led it, comparing diversity experiments communities to the real world. And in that one, he found that in the biodiversity experiments, it kind of pulls these different components apart wider over bigger gradients than you get in the real world. So, the variation is bigger, but some of those combinations are kind of like not realistic, or not, you won't find them in the real world. So they're good at kind of making it orthogonal, but like some of the variation is sort of unrealistic or not really realized in the real world. Yeah. And that maybe just I'll have one more little question and I'll shut up if that's okay. And that was and this was a smaller one, and that was again, when you were talking about asynchrony and species richness relationships and how there was a limit to asynchrony. I wondered again about, biodiversity experiments where you do see a quite strong asynchrony diversity relationship, but there you've only got from 1 to 8 or 16 species. And I guess in over that range, then there is a diversity richness relationship, but maybe not over, the range that you would see between 10 and 70 species, like in a real grassland. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I plotted this figure first because I realized here that this is a log scale. So I forgot to measure this log scale. So this is indeed confirming your theory that usually in natural communities you have a much bigger range, and when you have a bigger range of variability, you cannot increase the asynchrony too much. The more species you add, there is a limit to that. It's true at the same time that there has been a trend in using very often this index of Loro and colleagues, which is phi, which has this built-in property that it decreases with the number of species, and it's a mathematical effect. And for some people, I spoke many times with Jan Hautier. He's a colleague who has you have seen many studies on biodiversity experiments and stability from him, and fertilization, and we share a student and we speak very often about it. And for him, yes, in his head is like more species, it has to be lower synchrony. So the index has to do this. Okay, but if this is your hypothesis, then you should have a null hypothesis, which is an index that doesn't have this built-in relationship. So I wonder how much of the studies that we find in literature are because of this smaller range, which is a totally fair and logic hypothesis, and how much is because of the index used. I don't know, but I think there is a bit of both.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Hope to see you around soon.
Thanks, Francesco. There's a couple of questions in the chat that I'm going to read out. The first one is, about whether the relationships between synchrony and functional dissimilarity or response diversity, I guess, rely on abiotic factors being more important than competition or species interactions. It's basically the relative importance of abiotic versus biotic variables in these relationships. Do you have any?
Okay. This line yesterday evening was different. Okay, there was another line here which goes like this, and it was written here, abiotic, biotic. Okay, so I'm sorry that I removed it because I thought it was too much information. But so I'm very happy that this question comes along. Yes, the idea this occurs when you expect that different traits means different adaptation to the environment. But the other hypothesis is that when the species are competitive species, so like a stall species, or according to Tillman, fast growth species, according to Grime, slow growth species, there is still debate on what is a competitive species. But let's say that both species are competitive and they are similar. So their pattern is that you should have negative correlation between them. And this is, so you can expect at least something that goes like this, or something that goes like this. You can have several patterns. And that's why I think that actually when we do this relationship, what we observe is not so strong, because there are both patterns. And even here, we don't see many of these factors, because we know that the thing is more complicated. I think this prevails overall. This is clear, but beneath there must be also the other effect, which is that particularly between competitive species, they could compensate or alternate each other. If we think about hypotheses like how you call it, this Caesar intransitivity competitive interactions, in which one year I win, the other year I win, and between species that are not equally but similar, they have slightly difference in response rate but similar competitive abilities. And so yes, it is more complicated than this. In what I wanted to say is that this prevails, and I also want to say that all these analyses that we did, this and this and this, they are all basically at the level of a given site. So here you have 3 plots behind this line. And here you have maybe between each of the points, you have 10, 20, 30 plots. So it's like meta community level. So the meta community level, if you are similar, you respond similar. But at the community scale, so within a given plot, this relationship is much weaker. And it's probably because of this. Also because there is less pairs. So it's again, it's difficult to know. But I am really happy that there was this question. I didn't want to get into it because it's a bit complicated, but yeah, at least we spoke about it. Also, Peter, Pete, can you also add in the chat the paper that you were mentioning now that
that's exactly what I'm doing right now.
Thanks. Great.
Yeah.
I hope I answered the question.
That's great, Francesco. Thank you. There's one question. We've got time for maybe one more quick question here from Megna. And she says, I was wondering whether you have any thoughts on the potential role of rare species or functional rarity in contributing to temporal stability. Is it possible that such effects may not emerge in experimental communities due to the constraints of species selection? Also, might the role of dominance for stability vary with abiotic context if the community fluctuates around different baseline environmental conditions or so on?
Yeah, I agree. And this is also something that when we talk about the insurance mechanism and redundancy can be obtained in different ways. Yeah. And redundancy could be exactly this, that you have, let's make it here. Maybe these rare species, this is a bit rare, but we lose 2 more dominant species that are not adapted to the new environmental condition. And this species now becomes more abundant. So it takes over the space left by some species. Okay, so in this figure we don't see too much the change in dominance or biomass, but exactly the rare species could potentially compensate for the loss of dominant. So if a dominant species is replaced by a rare species that has similar traits but was rare because it is less adapted to the environment, but the condition changes, this rare species become dominant. So indeed, this mechanism is a very important mechanism of stability, and it is a typical idea of redundancy, which is not present in the idea, because if I measure, they suggest to measure functional diversity, basically, which is weighted by the abundance, so you will not see it. So we need the measure of redundancy, ideally, should take into account response diversity, difference in response diversity, differences in effect diversity, and differences in abundances in the sense of the potential to replace. And even potentially the species that are absent from the community, but that could potentially become to the community. So this is the case of extreme rare species, like so rare that you either didn't sample it or is just potential, but not there. So this is dark diversity is the concept of rarity brought to the very extreme in a way. It's a similar idea, basically.